Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning into another interview on the Art of Intervention Project, where we are trying to educate. Well, we're not trying, we are educating families and individuals and professionals about moving from addiction to living a transformed life. And I love it when people take just a unique path to educate and bring their passions to people. And Tim Harrington has definitely done that. He is an out of the box thinker, and a guy's just bringing a new message to people around the country and around the world. So, Tim, thanks for making some time to hang out with us, and looking forward to getting into this with you.
Yeah, me too, Rob. Thanks so much. I appreciate you including me in this.
Yeah, for sure. When I went down my list of people, I'm thinking, who? Oh yeah, Tim. Who? No, who? Yeah. So that was
So,
cool. But when you describe yourself, like, how do you say, hey, here's kind of who I am, what I do, and why I do it?
yeah, so I had, just to kind of give some context to it, I had a 16-year love affair with vodka and cocaine as my two, what I call drugs of solution. And that led me to many iterations of sobriety and different ways of trying that through therapy, abstinence on my own, just working out more, different job, different zip code, the drill. So all of those iterations of my life. And I was 36 years old and I was mobile homeless, I call it. I was high bottom. I still had a car and I still had a phone. I didn't have a home other than the four wheels of my beat up Honda Civic. And I was driving up and down PCH in Malibu because if I was going to be homeless, I was going to be homeless in Malibu. My ego was just, running the show. It seemed that all seemed cool to me, and trying to come up with new iterations of myself in terms of how I was going to deal with my cumulative challenges, if you will. And next thing you know, through a series of circumstances and coincidences and the like, I ended up at the last house on the block, literally in Santa Monica, California, at a meeting. And the reason that was because I was an AA legacy. I had been to treatment where AA was a part of that system. And so when it got as narrow as it did, as a mobile homeless person and really not being able to figure it out, so to speak, I ended up at that meeting, and so I was launched in a different direction. I was knocked out of whatever orbit I came in with, and I went in a different orbit, and I'll be forever grateful for that. It was so funny, Rob. Here I am, like, the color blue gray, just tore up from the floor up, as we say, and sitting on the steps out front, smoking a cigarette because I smoked a lot of cigarettes. And this young lady came up to me and she said, "Hi, I'm Natalie. What's your name?" And I was like, "Are you kidding me? Really? Like, get out of my face. Like, I have no time for any chit chat, And she said, "Would you do me a favor?" And I was like, "Okay." And she's like, "Will you read chapter 5?" This is my first day of like just trying to, like, do something different, right? And I'm thinking, and my MO is always to kind of look up to the sky and go, "Really, dude?" Or whatever.
Yeah.
A lot of "why hast thou forsaken me" moments in my past. And I was like, and I couldn't disappoint her, you know what I mean? So I said yes. And next thing you know, I'm at this place. It's 26 and Broadway in Santa Monica, if anybody out there's ever heard of it or been there. It's been there 40, 50 years now, I think, as a meeting house. And God, 60 years now. Anyway, so I'm standing there and it's got a very low ceiling and they have these can lights that are literally in your face. They're like this far away.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm already sweaty. I'm already like, and I have these lights beating down on me and I'm sweating. And I'm thinking in my head, I have this other dialogue going, "This is the most fucked up moment of my life." Pardon my French. Anyway, so I'm just having these dialogues going. I'm saying the words and I'm having this other narrative going on. And I'm sweating and I get through it. And it seemed like I was up there for days. days, and finally it ends, and people started clapping, and I'm thinking, what the hell is going on here? So I sit down, and I had a transformational moment where everybody came up to me after the meeting, and they just like they do, people gathered around me, and they gave me encouragement, and told me to keep coming back and all of that stuff. And it was, it was still uncomfortable, and I still wasn't sure, and all those sort of normal things that go on in a person's mind when they're in those kinds of situations. And so now, let's just say 19 years later, April 23rd of this year, I've been on this, what I call discovery journey, recovery journey, but mainly of discovering more about myself, the world, other people. I got married, I had kids, a lot of things that I never wanted to have happen in my life have happened. I have problems in areas I never wanted to have areas. And all of that comes together, both personally and professionally, to develop who I am today, which is somebody who has had experience of being a sober companion, working in treatment, living with people in their home environment as what I call an embedded journalist type situation, where I have a front row seat to the families who put, like my family did, the fun and dysfunction, and you clearly can see how everything is working. You can see the drama, right? You can see the relationships, you can see how people communicate. And I worked in treatment, so I could see very clearly how important family was, because people started to freak out about 2 days before family program, and then you'd have to put them all back together afterwards, and so all that being equal, I became extremely fascinated with any information I could get about family and recovery. And so I took a deep dive, and there's not a lot. There's more about pathology, there's more about disease, and there's more about personal recovery than there is family recovery out there. But whatever I could find, I devoured, and I ended up, creating sustainable recovery, because what I was interested in was what was the truth for any one individual or system that helped them to stay out of the old iteration of the family system and the old communication patterns, so that they could sustain some kind of positive, healthy change, right?
Yeah.
It's what we all want for people who are out there struggling, and I like to tell families, I say, drug and alcohol, I'm going to say it the right way, alcohol and other drugs, and the addictions around them don't come in bottles and cans and syringes and baggies and things like that. They come in systems. So what we get to do is we get to remodel these systems so that they function in a healthy way. And that's sort of the mission statement. That's the brand promise of sustainable recovery for an individual or a system, depending on who's participating. But no matter who's participating, they're part of a bigger system, right? They're their own system, and then they're members of other systems, whether it's their jobs or their, it's relationships, right, Rob? That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, it completely is. And I mean, you and I got sober 19 or clean sober. I know people have a lot of different ways they want to say it, but 19 years ago, our lives changed to substances were no longer a part of it. And back then, the landscape was a lot different than it is now. The people were using the language you're using right now. It was really 12-step recovery was kind of it back then, right?
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, and there were pockets. There were outliers, as we would call them. There were these people who were doing it in a different way. They were expressing things in a different way. And I got the language, different languages, from a guy named William White. And William White is one of my heroes. I mean, I get the chills thinking about it, because that was another one of those shifts in orbit when I found him. And I went into a deep dive on his website, williamwhitepapers.com, and started doing the research about the science of recovery, which was his whole mission was like, we talk a lot about pathology. Let's talk about recovery, and let's use the resources of these millions of people over many decades who have recovered in many different ways. It's a vast treasure trove, right, of experience that isn't necessarily, like you're saying, fits into that very narrow sort of eye of the needle sort of landscape. And and I was just like blown away. I learned things about the continuity of care, the continuum of care, recovery-oriented systems of care. I learned about recovery management. I learned about coaching. I learned about all these different things. I learned about different communities who were doing things in a different way. And what I learned, I think, mostly was what was specifically beneath the behavior and symptoms of alcoholism and addiction, other addictions, not even having to do with drugs, because you and I both know that it isn't just about drugs, it's about behaviors, it's about gambling, it's about shopping. But underneath all of that, what is the driving force or the protagonist that leads people to, any individual, to having these relationships with these things that cause necessarily for many of us negative consequences, right? And why do we persist despite those things, those negative consequences? And what are the driving forces, and how do we specifically address those driving forces? And what makes one person more susceptible than another person to developing these relationships with what I call drugs of solution? Because I always, what I remember about my story was people constantly reminding me that I had a drug problem. And I was like, no, I don't. You couldn't be more wrong. So I don't know how to continue this conversation if you're not going to understand that these drugs are not my problem, they're my solution. And everyone would just look at me with with crossed eyes and like shaking heads and like, what are you talking about? And it was just as clear as day to me that it was just, it was my solution, maladaptive as it was, based on the consequences I was getting or not getting, as the case may be. It was just one of those things that made perfect sense to me. And I try to, when I have relationships with people, is to frame it in a way that is really more about a person's experience than my own sort of impression of what it is, because it's really more about their story than it is about mine. And I respect that. I respect people's right to self-determine, you know what I mean? And that makes me more of an ally than somebody wants to have an argument with,
Yeah, coming into it and saying, well, I know exactly what angle I'm going to take with this, Tim, because I will say, I mean, you look at the landscape a lot differently than a lot of people. And especially when we talk about substances and gambling and all that stuff, the underlying thing is let's just say a mental health issue of just like what's going on underneath that's driving a lot of these things too. So I would love, and I want to encourage people to go tap into everything that Tim does, because you do a lot between, sustainable recovery and Wide Wonder. And you have various programs you put together, which are really cool and different. But you traveled the country with your family, and I would love for people to hear about that, because I know there's a ton in this as we open up this door, but you saw the whole country with your family. So you can speak a lot more to that than someone that has an office in 4 walls and that's all they do, which is not, I mean, I don't mean that lightly, but you've seen it.
And the motivation behind that was both personal and professional. My wife is Robin Cruz. She is in the eating disorder world. She wrote a book called Making Peace with Your Plate, which is, again, the foundation of that is sort of your relationship with food, your relationship with anything, basically, that causes a person upset or causes a person to struggle in terms of how they cope with the world. Because I believe at the end of the day, it all boils down to my relationship with people, places, and things that determine the quality of my life. And if I can work on my internal stuff about how I can be healthy, even though I don't agree with you or you're not doing what I want, then I'm going to have, a more content life, let's put it that way. So when it came around to a couple of years ago, my wife and I went to Australia. She's from Australia, to hang out with the family, and we got really away. Australia is on the other side of the world, so you have this, you're out of sync with home and necessarily people you would normally communicate with, your normal patterns. And so we had this really concentrated time to think about what we wanted the next iteration of ourselves to be and our family to be. And we came up with this crazy idea of partnering with Eating Recovery Center and traveling the country and putting on community events about stigma, about addiction and mental illness related stigma, because that had been a thing that I had been developing over time in terms of what I wanted to be a part of my advocacy as a professional and as a person in long-term recovery. And because I started to discover, as I did a deep dive into stigma, that it is the number one barrier, or what I call friction, in between somebody who wants to access treatment and to change their relationship with alcohol and other drugs. And it was really mind-blowing because many people didn't have the language in the field we're in about stigma. They knew of it, but they didn't know it at the depth that I had started to discover. And so it became very important to me. And so we developed Wide Wonder, and Wide Wonder is the notion of exploration, curiosity, living sort of going back to the eyes of a child and being very interested in discovery, more discovery, and seeing this beautiful country. Both Robin and I are accomplished travelers, both intentionally and unintentionally, as we dealt with our individual challenges. And we've been all over the world. She'd been all over the world. I've been to different places of the world and in the country as I tried to, there's hope in a geographic kind of thing. And so we decided to do an RV and maybe travel a few months and do some events. Well, that changed over time as we continued to explore the opportunity to renovating an old school bus. And I got there through a Facebook group, and I saw these people who had done this really cool work, and it was it was like a blank canvas. And the reason for schoolies ultimately was because they're big giant tanks. I mean, they're so safe, right? That they carry your kids to and from school, right? So they have to be, they have to fulfill certain requirements of safety. And that was important to me as a father. So we went with that. We had it remodeled and to our specs, because if we were going to be in it a year, it had to be like home. It had to feel comfortable. So we ended up doing that. We set up 30 events around the country. We sold our house. We downsized. We moved onto this bus. And I just recently looked at an old film of the very first day that my daughter, Lily, had filmed us as we were driving away from our house. And I got to tell you, it all sort of came together in that moment. I before I was on camera, I'd already cried. I'd already it was cathartic and it was also terrifying. But we took off and there we went. Off we went, towards Kansas and Oklahoma and into the wild blue yonder, as they say. And what I can tell you about that in a very sort of snapshot view was that what we discovered was what a lot of people kind of already knew, and that was there's not a lot of education around a deeper level than just kind of understanding stigma on a surface level. And then also what was really interesting, Rob, was, one of the biggest themes was divisiveness. We all know what that means as a theme at the macro level and even the micro level, this notion of being divided and people wanting us to be divided necessarily by really staying in two different camps and arguing our points without really trying to find common ground, because there is common ground no matter what you believe. There's always the connective tissue in between, and I feel like that's what we've lost. You know what I mean? And you can break that down into family systems and all your relationships, right? It's what's the common ground, what makes you and I connect, not just focusing on what makes us different. And I started talking about that from the standpoint of stigma and from the standpoint of family systems, is why do we get stuck in this space where we don't get in here, we stay over here in these camps. And so from a family standpoint, it would be the parent saying to the child, stop doing that. You're upsetting us, you're hurting us, you're doing all this stuff. And then my job as a family recovery coach is to figure out how to connect, even though these things are true and they're happening. In spite of those things, how do we get in there and start the healing? And so that became a huge theme around the country with the events that we had met, because we'd have these events and people would sit in these rooms in these communities, and they were in the same communities, but nobody knew each other.
Right. Yeah.
They would say like, hey, I didn't even know you exist. We got to get together, like that kind of thing. And so that was a very proud outcome for us in terms of just being connectors, because that was part of our platform, was connection, community, and bringing people together and trying to keep them together. Because you and I know, we go to events where people come together and then we kind of blow apart, and we come together and we blow apart. And our goal is always to sort of maintain connection. And that's really the challenge, right? It's to continue to sort of sustain that connection. And so we did this. We traveled a year. We had the most amazing time. Personally, we got as close as a family can get. We're on this 250 square foot bus. We're bumping into each other all the time. You can't get much privacy. and there's all kinds of things happening. We're having our own personal challenges because both my wife and I struggle with what we struggle with, as far as mental stuff and emotional stuff, and then it just gets concentrated and highlighted. And so we worked through a lot of stuff. It was really amazing experience, and seeing this incredible country and realizing how we are way more alike than we are different. And it was just inspiring to no end, about what we learned. And we can't, it's weird. We get back and we were sort of trained for COVID, right? Because we got off the bus. We had literally like a month and a half and we were back on, this bus, another iteration of just being isolated, so to speak. And the girls already knowing how to do online school. So we felt lucky as you could in this situation. And, but what we continue to learn is how to get along despite our differences, because we're not the same on every level, right? We have different values. We have, we have all of these things that create an opportunity for conflict. And so conflict resolution, being people in the industry like you and I and around intervention, is about conflict. There's a conflict. There's a disconnect in values. There's crisis, there's struggle, and I feel like we got an up close and personal ongoing vision of what that's like to work that out as a family. And, I think it's prepared all of us, for whatever is ahead. And we're not perfect and we still struggle, but we always can go back to that thing of like, look, we made it through some really, really difficult things. We have a lot of strength as families and as individuals. So let's focus on what we're, some of our attributes, and our positive attributes, to get through whatever comes in front of us.
So valuable too. And when you were talking about the space and you were kind of highlighting it in the air, I think of like, the space on this side of my head is my voice saying, here's what you should do. And over here is like the parent saying, here's what you should do. And in the middle is just this mess. So you help people kind of penetrate that mess and say, wow, we made it through the first time doing that. Heck, this scary place of this entering in, let's try it one more time. Oh my gosh, it worked again. And you're leaving a legacy, man, teaching your kids that. Like, that is so cool, that an experience they will never, ever forget. And hopefully, I'm sure, help other people explain what they experienced and just be complete advocates, intentionally or unintentionally.
100%. In fact, one of the things that happened on the trip that we were not really wholly prepared for was because they were living in an online digital world with their friends that they had left behind in Colorado, and keeping in touch in that way, and doing some gaming. And there's a thing called Discord that they stay in touch with, playing games and communicating, and even Instagram accounts. What they were discovering was kids their age, their peers, were struggling at a very high level, an acute level, with their own mental injury, their own emotional injuries, and they were talking about it in these forums quite openly, which, wow, we were like at first like, what, and then we were like, well, of course, and so we felt like, that was definitely an opportunity for us to teach them some languaging. And so we dived right in and gave them some tools in terms of, that comes up, here's what you can say, and here's how you can support these kids who were talking about, they were injuring themselves and they wanted to run away. And some people would literally articulate that they didn't want to be around anymore. And these are kids, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. And, it kind of rocks me even when I think about it now, because it takes me back to my age when I was around those ages. And I think, wow, I had nobody to talk to. I was in my room, one of my coping mechanisms besides, alcohol and other drugs was music. And I would disappear into music, and I would fantasize in my room by myself. I spent a lot of time by myself, fantasizing about being a rock star, like blowing this pop stand, and like, having all the adulation and being famous and being rich, and, because that was going to fix everything. That was going to be my escape. And while all this chaos was going on above me in my household, divorce and people not good at relationships, and people have unresolved traumas and all of that chaos. And yeah, it took me back, and it's become a passion of ours to continue to draw attention to this younger population so that we may hopefully, intercede and intervene so that they don't have these long careers around, alcohol and other drugs. It's real. You know
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, please. I mean, just to help save people to not go down the path that you and I went down on. I mean, you went from, like you said, mobile homeless, and then choosing to be, now in a mobile home again along the way, and in the beginning you mentioned the word renovation. You had to renovate the entire thing. And
Yeah.
and I believe you've kind of come up with the term renovention.
Yes.
And so talk a little about like what is a renovention that you have developed.
Yeah. So renovention is a way of looking at, I think in images. So that's the reason why these words come up for me is I think in images, and I look at a family as sort of a house in disrepair, one that has great bones, but has sort of, gone into disrepair for these reasons of struggling with addiction and mental injury, emotional injury. So you have this stigmatized family who stays isolated in this house, and that's why it doesn't get a lot of attention and it continues to fall in disrepair. And so the opportunity, and I like to talk about this, and I want to make sure I talk about this, is that I see addiction and mental health issues, mental illness, mental injury, emotional injury as opportunities, 100%, because I'm proof of that, and so many of the people we know, you are, and, thousands, if not millions, for sure, millions of people are proof of this as being an opportunity to reimagine, repurpose, remodel, whatever wording you want to use, to go from a place of struggle and overwhelm and crisis to an iteration of yourself and the system you come from, to become something that you could never have imagined if you hadn't had the interruption of addiction and mental injury and emotional injury. So it's an opportunity. So renovention is a way to look at it, to organize your thoughts, to reframe for families so they can see it in a way they may never have seen it before. Because that's one of my main jobs when I work with families, is to have them say to me, I never thought of it that way, because that's my way in. Because they necessarily come to you with all these beliefs, right? These entrenched beliefs, whether it's stuff they've learned in their previous go rounds in treatment, and what they've learned and been socialized by as they've grown up in their worldviews from their families and so forth. So this is an opportunity to remodel that so that you can, for yourself, create this masterpiece of a place you live that already has good bones. And the good bones are inner strength, resilience, all of the attributes that every person has that gets buried by all this other stuff, gets buried by addiction, mental injury, the experiences you've had, the traumas, everything else. It buries you. And so you feel heavy, you feel depressed, you feel trapped, you feel isolated, you feel hopeless. And so with renovention, you go in and you start to, you bring in the crew, you bring in, I think of HGTV as like this perfect analogy of like, it's demo day,
Yeah, right.
And so
And you bring the sledgehammers, right? You're like, let's go.
we're as delicate as we need to be. We're as indelicate as we need to be. It's a very organic process, and every family is different. But the ultimate goal is to create a new reality based on healthy principles, modalities that people respond to, language that people respond to, pathways that people respond to. Because I don't want to come in and say, this is the way your house should look. It just, people are going to go, they're going to look at me like, what are you talking about? What if I don't have the same style as you? What if I don't like blue? Whatever. It's like, so I want to be the person that says, I want to be a custodian of this process. I want to hold space for this process. I want to be the person that is the third, what I call the third leg in the stool. So now we have some balance, whereas before it was teetering back and forth all the time, always on the precipice of crashing. And so that's my role. And so I'll insert myself when it's necessary. I'm not going to be the one to control everything, because that's the old me. And I had to go through my own iterations of my own healing in order to stop doing that. Because when I first started this intervention work, Rob, I was not the same person I am now. Thank God. Like I had to go, and I go to on-site every year and do what I call this therapeutic exorcism through psychodrama that would just tear me down to the studs, really a remodel, and gave me an opportunity to get rid of some of that stuff. So that's sort of demo day for me, was on site, and that made me the person I am today, both as a father and a husband and as a person who does interventions and who works with families, is that it allows me to not make it about me, because I know what my role is now clearer than I ever did. So I have two different versions of Tim, as a person in recovery and then as a person who works in the field. And I'm forever grateful for being invited to that group. And so the renovation begins, and then I hold space. I say, try this tool, or I say, try this, and they say no, and they say, let me try that, or whatever. And then at the end of the process, they can stand outside in front of this renovated system and go, that looks right. It reflects my values. It reflects, who I really am underneath all of that other stuff that really blew out our family, the behavior and symptoms. And now we really have a chance at sustainable change. We have a chance at now valuing what we had as a family that we lost along the way. And so it's just I say fun because you start to really feel hope again as you're getting in there and remodeling your life and renovating your family system to be healthy.
Yeah, you start talking about like this family identity probably starts to evolve. Like 7 Habits has this book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Families, and you get
Totally.
those core values. And our kids
Yeah.
and I, we love to say, who are we? We are the Lohmans,
Yeah.
but they haven't seen my addiction, they in that world, but a lot of people have. And so in the midst of this chaos, we call it, losing each other and then starting to find each other again, this passion and excitement probably starts to light up in them, right? And then they're, man, let's try something else. And you're witnessing that firsthand. So hopefully, I'm hoping, as everyone's listening today, you families are listening and saying there is hope. And how do people start applying some of this this newness? Because it's scary to go in there, like we're now in that little space and you penetrated a little bit. How do they start like applying it to really see change?
Well, as you know, and I always compare it to my own story and just human behavior. Human behavior is what it is, and there's as you know, there's a treasure trove of behavioral science data and research out there going back decades, that how we've learned, how we evolve as people and what causes us challenge and why we get stuck. And there's this built-in immunity to change because we just don't want to look at our mortality. A lot of it is just, it's the fear of like, this is hopeless, or what's the point, and all these different sort of existential things that come up as far as being challenged by big upheavals and big changes. And life is about that, right? There's deaths, there's divorce, there's moving, there's retirement, there's just, how about just growing in a family like yours and ours? As kids change throughout time, there's little grief moments, because you get used to this one iteration of your child, and then the next thing you know, they're this different iteration. You're like, well, now I miss that one. Remember when I could hold them in my arms, and now they're running off, and it's like, I don't know what to do. And it's a mixed bag of emotion. And I think ultimately the opportunity is, if I was to break it all down in terms of being a renovationist or being a father and being a husband and all of that, is that I got to get healthy emotionally for myself. I need to understand how my emotionality affects all my relationships. I got to get skilled with my own resources, right? If I'm going to be in relationship with you, Rob, and it not being just about what you can do for me or not do for me, thank you very much, stop doing that. It's got to be about how I can hold the space in a healthy way, regardless if you're doing what I want you to do or not. You know what I mean? It's got to be, it's like that divisiveness, it's like that being in two different corners and fighting for the other person to just see it your way. It's like, that is a long road. I did that with alcohol and other drugs. I looked at them and I said, be what I want you to be. And they were like, I don't know what to tell you, dude. This is it. I can't take you any further. This is as far as I go. And I'm like, that's bull. You got to take me further. And it's like, no, I've run my course, and that was not okay with me. And so you break that down into every relationship you have, people, places, and things. And it's really the universe is saying, Tim, you got to get it together, man. You got to get your emotionality together. You got to learn how to live with other people. You got to learn how to be good at relationship. Otherwise, you're going to be continuously miserable, whether you're sober or not. It makes no difference. You know, I don't want to be sober and still emotionally blown out. I need some organization around how I present myself to you in a healthy way, so that if you're not going to do what I want or I disagree with you, I can be okay. And we can maintain our relationship and go the distance. And so that's the laboratory every day for me as a father. And then when I'm interacting with family, they're giving me back this information. They're saying, yeah, I hear what you're saying, Tim, but can you please fix this?
Right. Yeah.
And I'm like, this isn't about fixing. This is about healing. And that's a long game. That's a long game. And they're like, because they're in crisis, Rob, you know it. They're just like, you know, they're trying to like process that when they're trying to get resolution. They're sort of fixed on a long-term outcome, right? And in recovery, we say stay out of the results. And they're all about the results right here, right now. Take care of it. I'm in too much pain. I'm done with this. You know, even sometimes, as you know, the proposition is like, can you parent my kid for me?
Yeah. Yes.
And you're like, nope, I can't be your kid's parent. I got two of my own. I got more on my plate than I can deal with. So, but I can go along with you on this ride. I can continue to sort of give you some wisdom or whatever, but you got to get in the trenches. You got to learn how to manage your emotions in a way that you got to model. You got to model what it's like to be healthy in a relationship, and that takes skill. I tell my parents that I work with, I say the only perfect parents are the ones that don't have kids yet. First of all, let's start there. And then second of all, this isn't about whether or not you love and care for your kids. You have proven that to the nth degree. This is about how you love and care for them based on who they are and what they're going through. And that requires skill. That requires a reinvention. That requires new skills. That requires new perceptions, new perspectives. And so when people work with me, it comes down to this. You have to be all in as much as you want them to be all in. You can't tell them they got to be all in and you're going to be half in, because people recognize that. They're going to spot that from a mile away. They can clearly see that you're not in the whole way. You continue to tell them they're not doing enough, or you're continually asking them what they're doing. Did you go to a meeting? Did you blah, blah, blah? And it's like, you got to take yourself out of the role of police, and you got to stay in your role of mother, father, brother, sister, lover, whoever you are, and hold that space and be skilled at that. Because as soon as you blur those lines, they're going to push back. And this is about you developing the skills you never really had because you weren't called to task. And you get to be, again, the opportunity is to renovate yourself as a parent to be one you've never been before. And that's amazing, because you get a do-over. And you know how we talk about in recovery, we say, you can start over anytime you want. You can wake up at 7 and start over at noon. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I think I start over minutely sometimes on some days when my self-care is off. When my self-care is off, I am not the best father and husband and all those things as well. So I think it's a
100%.
huge thing for people to hear is learn how to put your mask on first on the airplane when it's going down or whatever, to take
Use
care
that one all the time.
of your child or someone next to you. So I love everything you're doing, man. You're just, again, I hope people tap into what you're doing and go check out Tim's website. What's your best website people can check out, Tim?
You can check out sustainablerecovery.net, and on the landing page, it'll take you to the different areas as far as reinvention, as far as do a thing for struggling to thrive youth, people who are have purpose anxiety, and then the family page as well. And what connects to all of those is value systems. That's really where we start.
Perfect. Well, that is great. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope you have a great day. It's beautiful here in Colorado, wherever people are tapping in from, but it's just, it's great to be alive. So and be in a home. Thanks so much.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Thanks, Rob. Appreciate you.
Yeah, you got it.